What's up, everybody? It's Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads. And with me, I have Jake Payne, our editor in chief. And together, this is our What's the Headline podcast. What's happening, man? I think we are 4 for 4 now, the last 4 weeks.
That sounds about right. Yeah, last week was a little different. We interviewed Royce and, Royce the 5'9", and I think just given, several holidays over the weekend, we ran it earlier this week, which was cool. And you and I sat down. I don't think we thought it was going to be a 2-hour conversation. It wasn't just Royce either. It was our mutual friend Kino as well.
Yeah.
But that was some people, I don't know about you, but some folks were texting me. I saw some comments. Some folks were really digging that conversation.
Yeah, that was dope, man. That one felt like family. You know what I mean? Like Kino and I are super close. Like we will talk about whatever. We've had a lot of fun times together. He alluded to some that we did not discuss.
Yeah.
But that's my guy. And because of that, I've gotten to know Royce decently over the years too. Royce is always just such a great dude, like humble, like laid back. So that was a real cool conversation, man. And even like I never thought we would discuss like, Courtney Bell versus La Russell versus
Simba.
You know what I mean? Like that's just such a wild tangent to go on, but it's a cool part of that conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, I always appreciate Royce because he's been one of the artists, one of the biggest artists that's just been a supporter of AFH beyond him. Like clearly, even down to that La Russell Simba discussion over, the last, I would say close to 10 years when we've covered things. Royce has commented, he's shared, he's engaged with the comments. And I always appreciate that. And he was I would say one of the first 10 people I ever interviewed when my career started in the early 2000s. And I think you and Royce have more of a personal relationship as well as a professional one. Mine with Royce has been more in the professional capacity, but I really enjoyed that conversation and I really appreciated, some of the compliments he gave us and our platform.
Yeah, for sure, man. No, that's always great to hear, whether from him or from viewers or whatever. Like, this is a grind, you know what I mean? And I think both of us would do it for free. I have done it for free for a number of years, you know what I mean? And, listening to Black Thought, which we're going to talk about later on today, like he talks about that quite a bit, how if you can align your passion with like what actually like gives you money, then that's like the perfect thing. But like for him, it's not about the money, it's about the passion. And even though for us, it is about the passion, that doesn't mean it's not a grind at times too, No,
absolutely. And, but it's when you hear that and you see that it reframes perspective. That's a phrase, a word you've always said to me in times when I've been weary or times where I've been fatigued of just like, perspective. And yeah, I love that. I think it was you that put me on to a Mark Cuban quote years ago about, how you start to supplement your dreams, always have another line of revenue in play. And then over time, you can ultimately, if you're lucky and if you work at it, I don't know if lucky is the right word, but if you truly work at it, you can make your passion also what supports you. And it is a grind. And I don't think to anyone who has never done it, regardless of the medium, you never can estimate what that grind really looks like until you do it.
Absolutely. But like supremely fortunate to have been able to do this, man. I would have never thought in a million years growing up as a kid in Indiana that I would be able to sit and have a conversation with a Royce, a DJ Premier, an MC8, Kendrick, whoever it may be, man, Jay-Z. Like that just it's mind blowing, man. And so like I count my blessings every day.
Absolutely. And with that said, please, for anyone out there, whether you watch us or listen, hit that subscribe button on whatever the platform. Give us a like if you can, a comment, a follow. With everything we just said, it's with others in mind, and it's not just you and me talking to the world. This is community. This is conversation. You and I regularly engage with folks that have something constructive, something positive, sometimes something of disagreement. And this is why we do it. And we're building this community together in real time. So please take those steps and tell a friend if you can.
Absolutely. And so another person that we have both had the good fortune of speaking with I think on a number of occasions now, both informally but also interviews, is Black Thought, who just is one of my top 10 MCs, has been for a very, very long time. I remember exactly where I was when I heard Distortion of Static for the first time. It was Rap City's countdown. I think they did a top 10 countdown on Fridays, and I think it was 94, 93, 94. And I searched, obviously before the internet, I searched record stores around the city for that for weeks until finally I found a cassette single in Central Square, and I'll never forget it, man. And then I saw the Roots at this place called Axis. It was a club that, smaller than SOBs, probably held about 400 people, something like that. Questlove did a DJ set to open it up. It's the first time I heard Milk Bones Keep It Real.
Oh, wow.
We dropped that. And then I saw them perform pretty much the entire Do You Want More album live in a venue like that, man. And so ever since then, I've just been a massive, massive fan of Black Thought. And he made some waves this week with the release.
Most definitely. Yeah. I mean, we have had, by my count, 6 Black Thought projects. And most of those I would consider albums. I know that we always get lost in the semantics anymore, but 6 projects in 5 years, that is insane. And let's not forget, this is the 30th year after Organics, which is kind of the demo debut for the Roots. So Black Thought's in his 30th year as a professional, by my count, and, waited all of this time to kind of isolate himself as a solo voice. I know all 6 of those projects have been with various producers, like kind of like a tandem, but now it's like he's just making up for lost time, being super prolific. And despite that the quality has never wavered, and that's very evident in this latest release, Glorious Game.
Which is insane, man. Just for context, I mean, the Roots in that 30-year period have done 14 albums, right? And some of those are like soundtrack and live. When it comes to just pure studio albums, I think it's close to like 10 or 11. So for Black Thought to have done 6 albums in 5 years versus that amount for them in, nearly 30 years is just, he's on an incredible, incredible run, and we make this comparison a lot, but it's valid. I think that he, Royce, and a few others have stepped into a different level, almost a prime of their career. Nas is arguably another one, right? Like in their 40s or greater. And so for him to do this right now in the state of his career, I think is really amazing.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about that. And you asked Royce a question, about hip hop being a quote unquote young man or woman's game. And, it was funny, like Royce said it is, but he's also living proof that it's not. And you called him on that.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, for sure. Thought Royce, Nas, I would say Jay-Z, for as great as he is, Master Ace.
Yeah,
I would say Fonte. We can go on and on and on. Just continue to get better. We did an interview last year with Cormega. I'd put him in there too. Maybe AZ. So yeah, there's some great examples, and I totally believe that. Hip hop thrives on the energy of the youth. There's no checkout time. Because these MCs keep getting greater and making art that hits the heart and souls of people.
That's true, but it's weird, man, because so obviously athletes are different, right? There's a physical skill and skill set that you have to have that just diminishes over time, unless you're Tom Brady, but still, at some point, Father Time comes and the saying goes, Father Time is undefeated. I would say that even though in theory that should not apply in music, I think it does, especially when you look at other genres of music. It's rare that you have artists, even like the Rolling Stones or U2 or The Who or whoever, who are touring consistently, put out great albums after a certain age, right? U2 had kind of a comeback with the album that had Beautiful Day on it. It was like maybe 10 years after their peak time, but that's so rare. I can't think of anyone else. David Bowie, just before he died, put out a well-received album, but nothing compared to like the prime of his career. But rap artists, the ones we've just named, some of them seem to be, to your point, actually getting better.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with you too. There's things like I remember that Rick Rubin, Johnny Cash album, that series of albums, but that was a very curated victory lap. Steely Dan won Album of the Year at the Grammys in the early 2000s. And, while that was a really good album, I don't think it necessarily compares against their 1970s work or their early, or Gaucho. And with hip hop, it's not always a victory lap. I mean, often it's not. It's the artists that we're talking about are breaking new ground and doing new things and expressing new vulnerabilities and rapping from new perspectives. The Rolling Stones had hits. Neil Young had hits in the 90s and in the 2000s, but there's a little bit of legacy to those hits, I would say. And in hip hop, it's totally different. These are artists that continue to evolve. So I think we're saying the same thing, but I wholeheartedly agree with you.
Why do you think that is? Royce, he talked about the fact that he didn't want to be Ozzy Osbourne when he was in his 70s. And what he meant was, in response to my question about his lifestyle changes. People know that Royce has been sober for a number of years now, but he also eats well, he works out, like he does a lot of things to take care of himself. And his comment was that he didn't want to end up like Ozzy Osbourne, who was really, really in bad physical health and just had to retire because of it. And it's been so for a long time, right? Like, very difficult speaking for him, shuffles, barely can lift his feet off the ground when he walks. Do you think there's something about how, there's we know a lot of unfortunate things that have happened where we've lost a lot of legends, not just to violence, but through medical conditions and things like that. Fife, Black Alicious,
Gift of Gab.
Gift of Gab. There've been a number of people, Biz Markie, a lot of people like that, right? What is it that you think has allowed rappers to excel in their 40s where other genres have not?
It's a really good question. I don't know. I think that it's also different times. I mean, the examples that we all listed, every one of those artists seems to have an accountability of to your point with Royce, like living your life, being healthy. You and Mass Ace, I clown you about it. And Mass Ace has been honest. He suffers from serious health challenges. And that being said, he has MS, I believe, right?
Yep, that's right.
And you had a conversation with him and Marco Polo about, what his diet and fitness looks like. I mean, and I know he's an avid football coach and all of these things. There's an accountability. And sometimes I think that in the 90s and in the 80s and in the 2000s, for a lot of, and this was true of hip hop, but definitely with rock, like you have to be the image. You have to party after the show. You have to drink. You have to smoke. You have to you look at the Rolling Stones. And while I always thought Mick Jagger was in incredible physical shape. I know he doesn't always look it, but he's an acrobatic guy well into his 70s, now 80s. You see Keith Richards up there, cranking Marlboro Reds, and similar to Ozzy, like the way he's conducted himself in interviews, it's not all there. And I think that hip hop took accountability, said, what can we do to not be like that? And live a longer life and be there, be there for families and for business interests and all of that.
Yeah, well, Black Thought has definitely defined the odds, and I think it's more than just music. We'll get into this. I think it's a great time to kind of reflect on Black Thought's career as a solo artist, because we've done this. We did a competition called Finding the GOAT MC, where we had, I think we started with 168 MCs. We did it bracket style. This is back in 2015, and let the people decide. Millions of people weighed in over the course of several months to decide who the greatest of all time MC was. And from that came some themes. We did a documentary about women because there was a real kind of lack in respect for women. I don't think a single woman MC made it out of the first round, and that includes Lauryn Hill and Queen Latifah, MC Lyte, and so forth, which is
Rhapsody narrated that. It was great.
Yeah, Rhapsody narrated that. You can find that on our channel. There was another one about the underdogs. And then one that was particularly pertinent to Black Thought was about how certain MCs are underrated, and it's likely because they're part of groups. So I think that even though everybody knows how nice Black Thought is, he's not mentioned in that GOAT conversation as much as I think he should, given the fact that he has been around for 30 years. He's been consistent with his output and is only getting better. I think he should be in most people's consideration for top 5, if not top 10. and possibly GOAT, but I don't think a lot of people think of him that way. And so I think that part of what's happened with him, though, is he stayed busy. He's continued to do other things, and that has only that's only helped him flourish in his career.
Absolutely. And there's new channels out here. I think that, and first of all, you said at the top, he's in your top 10. We did a special episode last year in summer, I think June of 2022, of kind of gathering a lot of top 5 and top 10 lists from other artists that have, we compiled that. And, at the very end, we asked each other, and unless I'm crazy, Black Thought was in mine. So you and I are both people that regard him as top 10, but I think he's benefited from some of the technological tools out there of being able to release an album outside of the label structure. Apart from one of these albums on BMG, they've all kind of been independent releases, and he's able to still do everything that he does, whether the Tonight Show, whether features, we're going to talk about it, multi-medium, hyphenate artist. So yeah, it's also a sign of the times, but I think that Black Thought is super calculated and very aware of legacy. You hear him refer about himself as the best often in his lyrics, more and more, I would say, over those last 5 years. And I wonder how much of he saw that and really stepped out with these projects. And, both you and I said last year, Cheat Codes, I felt, was a Grammy snub. I would like to see some of these albums get their due on the mainstream stage.
Absolutely. So, the point of that video was that he's been overlooked possibly because he's been in a group. And I think we now have a very strong body of work over a significant period of time to reflect on Black Thought's solo career. And so I want to spend some time on that, starting with the release that just came out today called Glorious Game. Every single one of these albums that Thought has put out over the last 5-6 years has been a collaboration with one producer or one artist, one group of musicians. And so this one is a little bit different in that it's not a producer. Michels Affair is a band that's got an incredibly rich history, having played, members have played and with Sharon Jones as part of the Dap Kings, and played with Wu-Tang Clan, backed up Raekwon and other members of Wu. Released an album of covers called Enter the 37th Chamber, and then
2 volumes, another volume.
Return to the 37th Chamber. And also, I thought this was cool because this is one of my favorite musical series, period, video or otherwise, Tiny Desk by NPR. This band also backed up Madlib and Freddie Gibbs when they had their Tiny Desk performance, which I always thought was just such an out-of-the-box Tiny Desk, by the way, but shows you the kind of musical chops these guys have. And so for Black Thought to perform with them is super cool, but it's probably also most like what he's been used to for his entire career, right? He's playing with a super skilled band of musicians. And in fact, I think 2 of them are now in the Roots too, or play with the Roots periodically. So in some ways, it's kind of a return to form, but I think sonically sounds very different than anything he did with the Roots. But what about you?
Yeah, I would agree. To me, this project, and Leon Michels, the front man and kind of creator of the Michels Affair, has referred to his kind of subgenre as cinematic soul, which makes perfect sense. And that really came to life. You mentioned the Return of the 37th Chamber, those 2 projects. In the Showtime documentary, they used their version of Cream in the title cards and on the outro, I believe. And it played so well in that. And they have just kind of it sounds like vintage instruments, and it has that haziness and that kind of red vinyl smoky room feel. And the Roots have had that at moments, but I look at their sound not ever as not overly hazy, not overly into kind of groovy vibes. And that's what I get with Glorious Game. So you're right, it is a live band with some personnel familiarity, but it's a totally different sound than I've ever gotten from a Roots album.
Yeah, and I think part of that is, so there was an interview that the Fader did, really great interview.
Shout out to Tim Hotep. Yeah, he did that.
Yeah, he really dope. Tim Aku, right?
Yeah.
And great interview. But, Black Thought during the course of that said that the Michels Affair played full compositions, but would then go back and sample those for the album. very much like what we saw with DJ Premier, with Adrian Young and others for Prime. I think that is like the best of all worlds. First of all, it's great on the business side because the publishing, you don't have to clear a bunch of samples and pay a bunch of people for it. But secondly, even though you're leveraging live instruments, you still get that hip hop feel and, rap music, even though Sugar Hill Gang, I think, rap to a live band, is still very much a sample based medium, especially since the 1980s or 90s, So I think Black Thought sounds great on it, but he has some interesting things to say in that interview. And definitely I encourage people to go check that out. He talked about what Glorious Game meant. And he said, for me, Glorious Game is just that information passed down from an OG, from a gatekeeper, from an elder statesman, with a cautionary tale here and there, but not preachy, and told from a personal perspective, just giving away some jewelry to move with, which, that's what Black Thought is now, man. He's a OG, he's an elder statesman, and he gives so much game in his lyrics, but it's often like kind of one-offs, just like he'll put a jewel in a line here and there, almost like what Jay was doing with 444. But this is filled with that kind of game.
Yeah, Nas does that too. I mean, Illmatic is filled with that, and over time, but you're absolutely right, and that makes sense because I think that Thought's gotten very comfortable as an OG, but I love the fact that he says not preachy. I mean, that's the thing that I've really appreciated of him is it's never too cerebral of a concept. It's almost like you're listening, and it's very hypnotic rapping, and it all makes sense. It's all coherent, and then he'll hit you with that one truism that you can move with and will resonate with you later.
Yeah. He also said that it was one of his most personal projects. He said, it's probably one of my most personal projects to date, and that I made a conscious decision. I said, okay, I'm going to make an effort for every song to be a story. So it's going to be all narrative, and it's going to all come from a personal place. I thought that was really interesting. Black Thought is a lot of things, but he doesn't get in storyteller mode that often. I think about Silent Treatment and You Got Me and things like that. But when you think about Black Thought, first thing that comes to mind isn't typically storyteller.
No, I would agree with you.
Yeah. So what was your first impression after hearing the album?
I will tell you it was an album, and I cannot articulate why this is. I liked it on the first listen, but it was kind of, like looking at a bunch of colors on a wall. And I've listened now, I think 4 times. And to be clear, we record this on Fridays. This album has been out less than 14 hours. And obviously there have been singles along the way, but on my second and third listen is where I really came to appreciate what he was saying. I take a song like The Weather, which is, it's interesting to read that quote, but it's basically Black Thought taking you by the hand to his grandmother's house in South Philly. And he's describing every single thing from the vinyl on the couch to the chicken or the fish, frying in the kitchen to what's going on outside. And like he even has to speak to the point we just spoke of. He has a lyric like, the only neighbor that didn't knock was opportunity. I'm butchering that a little bit, but it's that kind of line that you're going to carry with you. There's a reason why that jumps out at me after 4 listens, but it's so thoughtful. And then you think about it, and L. Michaels has this, nostalgic soul. So even though it's not trying deliberately to sound super 70s, I think the instruments that they play, the way that it's arranged, you feel like you walked into somebody's living room. And Black Thought is literally like a guided tour of it. And I think that is just one illustration, as well as the title track. Those are my 2 favorite songs, and I know both of which you put on the playlist.
Yeah, I got to say, I was really pleasantly surprised because as big of a fan of his as I am, I think for you and me both, we weren't really checking for the first single. In fact, I don't even know, did we even cover it? I think
we did, but we covered it under the guise of the news announcement of Black Thought has an album coming, and while you're here, check it out.
Yeah. So sonically, like, it didn't blow me away. So I came in, I guess, with like no expectation or maybe even lowered expectations. But man, really from song number 2, which is the title track, Glorious Game, on, and even the first track I like now too, I was blown away. I thought sonically it was just impeccable. And, Black Thought, and he says this later in that interview, that, he can be super lyrical, as he says, and be incredibly dense. And we've seen that from him many, many times. I think what he did with this one is he stepped back and he took it down and let the bars breathe more, and was way less complex without sacrificing complication. If you know what I mean, right? Like, so there's dense bars, they're heavy bars, but it's not necessarily because he's overwhelming you with words, many, many words. Like, the concepts are there, obviously his references and his, he makes a reference on even the opening song where he talks about being effed more than JoJo Dancer's house. Which is such a head trip, because first of all, you got another movie, JoJo Dancer, which is the story of Richard Pryor's life. He grew up
in a brothel, right?
He grew up in a brothel, yeah. Right? So, which is effed up, but also there's a lot of effing going on, right? So, like, he's hitting you with double entendres that only you'll understand it if you know the reference, which is not like a simple reference. You know what I mean? So there's the complexity is still there, but it's not overly complicated. So that struck me. But then just the sonic pleasure of it, because I'm going for the music first. So much that, like, I put 4 songs on the playlist. I had to restrain myself after a while, because I was just blown away time and time again.
Yeah, and actually, while we've been on this call, Black Thought, he liked our support of it on IG, so that's great to see that he feels the support. But to your point too, I think it's funny. Like, Grateful, I wasn't against it, but it didn't strike me, and that's happened to me. And I've mentioned on this podcast, the example that you always roast me for is J-Rock's, Win. When I heard A La Carte, I was like, it's not my favorite, and you were like,
I was the same way too.
Oh, you were? Okay,
I was the same way. It was the G-Funk joint that you said wasn't G-Funk, but was
that YG? Who was, or was it?
No, it was J-Rock. It was J-Rock. It was an OSOM or like non-double.
Now I got you.
Yeah.
But it's my point being, like, and you and I always make the case of like why albums are still important in a singles driven culture. I love the fact that a single sometimes doesn't work for me or doesn't excite me. And then in the context, put wherever it is. And in this case, Grateful is the first song. You appreciate it differently when you're surrounded by others and get more of a complete picture of what the artists are trying to do. It's one more reason why, albums matter and art matters like that. But yeah, this album definitely, I've really, it'll be something like, I hesitate to say, because the last time you and I did one of these podcasts, we were really gushing over Larry June and Alchemist, with The Great Escape. But this might be my new, and I'm in Philadelphia today, South Philly to be specific, but this might be my new album of the year so far.
It's a great start. One of the things, I love how intentional Black Thought was with the album. One of the things that Tim, the Fader interviewer, asked him was, how is this album different from your other output? Mm-hmm. And Black Thought said, I would say on Glorious Game, what people are getting that they haven't gotten before from me is nuance. My sweet spot is that I've come to understand over the past 8 years or so that because I've worked for such a long time as part of a collective and sort of serving the greater good of the Roots consensus, which is the point we've been making, my dexterity really is best served as a writer and as a storyteller outside of the Roots. If I'm working with one producer at a time, I could work with 20 producers on 20 projects simultaneously. I'm able to compartmentalize in that way, but as long as it's only one producer per project, I feel like that's my sweet spot. And that's like how I've been able to hit this productive stride in recent years since the Streams of Thought series began, which I thought was fascinating. And, he talks later on in the interview and says he's actually got several different projects going at the same time right now. We'll get into one of those in a few minutes. But he also said Glorious Game is probably one of my most personal projects to date, and that I made a conscious decision. I said, okay, we read that part.
The storytelling,
yeah. So yeah, man. I think that it's fascinating to hear how strategic he is about this stuff. To your point, a lot of people don't make albums, they're just doing songs for playlists. And even those who do, it takes a long, long time to create albums. We see Kendrick taking 4 or 5 years at a time now. And, J. Cole even taking a couple of years. But for Black Thought to be that prolific and that intentional at the same time, I think is pretty wild.
It is, and it's interesting. I mean, this interview illustrates this, but for a lot of years, Black Thought was, I always found to be more less in the spotlight. I think that Questlove Amir was often the mouthpiece of the Roots, and I think Gangstar was similar. Like in the '90s and early 2000s, like Guru did a lot of the interviews representing Gangstar, and Premier would do some secondary, and then over time, Premier, who's a phenomenal storyteller. I mean, you and I have interviewed him for AFH over the years a number of times, but it's interesting to see Black Thought, know his art and his purpose and his mission so well, and it's articulated brilliantly in this Fader interview, and then to have the companion and hear it in the album right now. This is definitely an artist that is developing at the highest level in real time.
Yeah, he talked about that specifically in the interview, how he had and still has anxiety speaking in front of people, and so for him it was easier because Amir, Questlove, is, he said, supremely gifted at it. Not only is he great at giving responses, but if he wants to avoid the question, he's great at giving you gab until you forget what the question was and you feel satisfied with what he said. But he said, Black Thought, that in recent years he's realized in order to serve a higher purpose, he has to confront that and actually, just jump head in. And it doesn't make it any easier, but it's part of the game and part of who he wants to become. And so he's done it to the point where now he's teaching college courses at NYU and performing on Broadway and doing all sorts of things that are outside of his comfort zone, but, just with the pure desire to get better, which I think is dope.
Absolutely, man. I was a fan. I mean, I remember when Black Thought was pivoting more into acting, I always thought Brooklyn Babylon was an enjoyable film. And I always thought that was very bold of him in 99, 2000 to make that film. But yeah, I mean, he continues to find more and more mediums. And, is doing things in film and television right now, and just truly being an artist on every possible level.
Yeah, another thing about this album is it's short. It's
I got it right here.
31 minutes, 31 minutes and 12 seconds. How much, in this day and age of being overwhelmed by information, I love an album, but I also love a short album. How much do you think that plays a role in your love for it?
It does. I mean, it's funny. There are artists, and I won't say any names, but I think we all have an artist that we know that oversaturates, like somebody we respect, and it's like, damn, you just released an album 2 weeks ago and you got another one. And one thing I'll say is 6 albums in 5 years. I've never felt oversaturated with Black Thought solo material, with these producer projects. It wasn't even I mean, you and I in December were sitting together, and I had a conversation with my man Andres after this podcast, and he let me know about the Afrobeat joint that he did with Sion Kuti, Fella's son. And like, to find out that Black Thought is putting out projects without heavy duty over the head marketing and all of that, it's a testament too. And it's like finding art. That same feeling of going to a record store and discovering something is still there. So yeah, I think that is huge. And to not make these overloaded 1 hour and 5 minute albums makes it that much easier to go from Cheat Codes to Glorious Game in less than a year.
Yeah, and to your point, The Great Escape is also under an hour. That's 45 minutes as well.
Is it? Yeah.
Coincidence. They're all killer, no filler, both of these albums. So one of the things that Black Thought said, to your point about his productivity, is that he approaches these projects very differently than the Roots did. He says the Roots have played it safe over time, and we've seen that. We've all heard the rumors about their new album being done, and that rumor has been going on for like 7-8 years now, maybe longer. We know that part of that delay was the death of their longtime manager, Rich Nichols, but still, it sounds like there's kind of almost a paralysis of analysis there. And Thought said that he does something very different with these. He said there's still something to be said about going with your gut. working in as close to an improvisational dynamic as possible. And that's what I that's what sets what I do outside the roots apart. I don't spend a lot of time if it's me and Ninth Wonder or me and Salam Remy or me and Sean C or Danger Mouse working on a thing. It's like I show up. Sometimes we get 2 songs done in a session. You know, and to his point, like the one he did with Salam Remy, he did basically in 2 sessions, recorded in 2 sessions, mixed in the third, and done. Which is it's crazy, but I think that's been a big part of why he's been able to be so productive in that time too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You know, we just we're spending some time talking about Just Blaze last month and the blueprint and kind of rehashing that story of a lot of the blueprint, Jay-Z's blueprint, falling together in the course of a weekend. You know, after he heard some beats, and then Justin, Kanye, and Bank went to work. And, you know, Tupac's All Eyes on Me is, you know, reportedly recorded in 2 weeks or less. And I think there's something to be said for just being in flow. You and I talk about that a lot, of like, when you're making these albums, the thing that amazes me with that is with Black Thought, there's no compromise of quality. And that applies to the music as well as the lyrics. There are artists out here that are super prolific where at times it feels rushed or it feels like a churn. And I don't get any of that. But, you know, I do see that when you're a group that's been around for 30 years and you've taken longer than a decade to release an album, you know, of course, that's going to weigh in. When you step forth, you're going to feel of, you know, responsibility and a pressure of the outage. You know, that's like Jay Electronica releasing his first album, and he, you know, the written testimony, and Black Thought has freed himself from those pressures. And he's just, you know, whether we're talking about the studio or putting out the albums, he seems very free with it. And I think the quality is there.
Yeah, I think being in flow is important, but also I think being in the same headspace. You know, one of the things that you tend to ask a lot of our people who come on as guests is how they were able to make it sound so cohesive, the album, if they work with different producers, right? I think part of that is, I think we have certain periods where we have a certain headspace. Like sometimes you like dark comedy, sometimes you might like a horror film or whatever it is, but our mood changes over time, and our musical taste does too. You know, what you're listening to now, heavy, might be very different than what you were listening to 6 months ago, and so on. And so I think to the extent that you're able to create a project within a shorter period of time, you're more likely to be in that same kind of musically cohesive space too. And we hear that with these projects too, beyond just working with the same producer.
That's really a good point. Interesting. And it amazes me of how in touch Black Thought is with his catalog, you know, whether the Roots, Money Making Jam Boys, Solo, you know, all of that. You know, recently you filmed at the De La Soul, you know, music event, and Black Thought grabbed the mic and performed. And it was funny, and I think we talked about it on here, but earlier that day, for whatever reason, I had listened to Bird's Eye View, you know, the joint he had done with, I think, Raekwon and Joey Badass for Static Selector's album. And that was the verse that he spit, which is a feature verse. It's a great one. But, you know, if you think of Thought doing a freestyle, you'd think it might be something of his own or something, you know. And I think to have an artist that literally, in my mind, I imagine Thought to just have like those old cards at the library when you would try to find a book. Like, he has rhymes for days, and that's what makes him just such an elite MC. And he's able to bring those rhymes to these projects. And this one being, to his interview, like you said, super personal, super narrative. I like that, and that distinguishes this one from the other 5 big time.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the other projects he's released over that time. You want to kind of, I know you laid this out. You want to break this down?
Yeah, I mean, so like I said, 30 years ago, the Roots, you know, put out Organics. It's kind of a demo that doesn't, as I understand it, and I wasn't around to receive it at the time, but it's a demo that is released, and it's always kind of been one of those asterisk things of whether that or Do You Want More is their first album. Kind of similar maybe to like Slum Village with Fantastic One versus Volume 2. Like they were clearly coming together, but they got a deal at, you know, DGC, David Geffen's company. And then they move over to MCA. And Black Thought for those first 7 years is primarily just a Roots artist. We start to see him later in the decade appear more and more in features. You know, you think of things like Black Star's Respiration Remix, which we actually have on the site, or Big Pun's Super Lyrical. You know, he starts to branch out. But in the 90s, in all of the 90s, you only get outside of the Roots, really one thing that I learned about today, I have to admit this. In 1998, he put out 2 records with a Japanese label with bassist Jamaluddin. The Hollers of the Horn is one, and then there's another one, Relax, which Lord Finesse, who we had on the show, did a remix to. I never knew that existed, and actually, it's much closer to the Roots than anything. Amir plays drums on at least one of those songs. But I remember, and this is where I can kind of come into the fold. I remember buying records in the late 90s, early 2000s, and he put out a single called Hardware on MCA, which was again where the Roots were signed at the time. Dice Raw put out a solo project. Like the Roots were getting very comfortable at that label. And it's funny, I should have pulled it out for this interview because I have it on the wall. That had a picture cover 12-inch, and it said from Black Thought's upcoming solo album. Mm-hmm. And I remember at the time, I mean, this was very much pre-rap internet the way that we know it. But people at the record store, my friends were all clamoring like, whoa, the Roots had just released Things Fall Apart, got a Grammy with You Got Me. And now we're going to get a Black Thought solo project. Like, what could that sound like? Because that single was produced by DJ Crush. And then oddly enough, you have 18 years go by before we ever really get the next Black Thought step.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy that happened. I don't remember that at all, right? But it's one of those kind of sliding doors moments where you wonder what would have happened if he had stepped out. Would he have maybe taken off and been solo from there on, and the Roots legacy would have been fundamentally altered, or would have been like more like Guru with Jazzmatazz, where he steps out for a bit and does something different, but then comes back. And it also makes you wonder why, because, we all know the economics of the music business, especially when it comes to big groups, that it's not that favorable. And a lot of times going solo is by necessity because you just can't be sustained, off your portion. We saw a lot of that with Wu. You wonder why Black Thought didn't step out, and it took, several years even after their last group album for him to do so. My theory is that it's just all a testament to his and Amir's personal relationship. I think that they function, it seems, from the outside, as like musical partners, and that's a partnership that is kind of never going to be done, ever, despite whatever else is going on. But also, it might be that we've seen that with other groups. A lot of times, there's tension and friction. When a person decides they want to go and do something solo, based on this interview that Black Thought had with the Fader, it sounds like that was never the case with the Roots. And he was always able, as was everyone else, to go off and do side projects, whether musical or otherwise. And in a reverse psychology kind of way, maybe that's actually what kept them together, is that they had that freedom.
That's a really good point. And I have to wonder too, we're going to talk about Dilla a little later in the podcast, but, MCA at that time was such an exciting label, and they had an A&R, Wendy Goldstein, that had signed or was developing a lot of great hip hop for a major label. I mean, you had Jay Dilla signed there. You had, I think, Slum Village for a minute before they went independent. Of course, Common, the Roots, eventually the Raucous artists ended up over there, but Black Alicious, you just mentioned Gab, was on MCA. I mean, on and on, Jizza, Killa Priest. It was a really interesting time. And as I mentioned, like there was kind of and you remember this probably, as an entertainment lawyer, but there was a period of time by like 2003, 2004, where like MCA and Geffen had folded in together, and a lot of those opportunities never came to fruition. But between 2000 and 2002, you also got Phrenology. Oddly enough, the weekend I moved to Philly in September of 2002, that weekend, the Roots and the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones did a free concert on the Parkway for all of, the new students in college and everyone else. And that album, I always thought was an inflection point of sorts for the Roots. They had already had, a hit with You Got Me, but I always thought The Seed became this like crossover song that was getting rock radio airplay and all these different things. So maybe those two ideologies of like what they're doing as a band, what Thought's trying to do alone, maybe it just was like, yo, I'm going to hold off on that. And by the time I do it, the label's in a different situation. It's actually a question I would love to ask Tariq. I'm curious if I have ever asked him. I've interviewed him a few times, but the fact that I don't have a definitive answer on the top of my head leaves me to believe I don't. So
yeah. So, he did obviously get around to it, but it wasn't until 2018,
with very little warning. I remember you and I speaking that album released in June on a super hot day, just like today. And I think we learned about it just a few days earlier. And that was the one I always think of it as produced by Ninth Wonder. I know it's Ninth in the Soul Council and Crisis did one joint on there. But man, oh man, that was one of the biggest stories we had that year, wasn't it?
It was. We did the premiere of that song, and I'd learned about it a little bit earlier because, Ninth hit me to it. Obviously was sworn to secrecy, but like was so excited for that. But something happened in 2017. I think there's an argument may have kicked off this whole thing. So December of 2017. The news cycle in music tends to shut down like first week in December. That's when people's best of the year lists come out, and people stop releasing albums, and it's just a bone dry period for music. But it was like December 13th or something like that, like middle of the month. Funkmaster Flex has Black Thought on for a freestyle, and he goes, I think, for like 13 minutes straight, something insane like that.
Yeah.
Just absolutely destroys it. And it created a massive, massive viral moment. Like we don't see this that often, maybe once every couple of years, where a pure performance, not a news item, a performance becomes a news item, to the point where, as funny as it is, right, he's on Jimmy Fallon, every day as on the house as part of the Roots being his house band. But Jimmy Fallon had him on the couch that day, talk about like this video that had gone viral. It was just insane. I think the reaction to that, I think there's an argument that kickstarted Black Thought into thinking, damn, you know what? The people want this, they need this. I'm gonna ride this. But what do you think?
I think you nailed it. I think that was a moment where hip hop, and I won't even say hip hop, but I feel like casual rap fans realize that arguably the greatest MC alive was hiding in plain sight. And and I loved it too, the fact that like you don't think of Funk Flex and the Roots together. You don't think of Funk Flex. All respect due to Flex, all respect due to the Roots, but like Hot 97 is not what I think of turning on to hear a Roots song. And Flex at that year, maybe a couple years prior, had begun using his YouTube channel to do these freestyles, and you're getting a lot of different artists, a lot of them on the come up. And you and I, Ambrosia covered a lot of them. And then Thought, at the time when, it seems like it's vacation week for a lot of the hip hop media, comes in and just puts everyone else to shame. I mean, our headline was something to the effect of "Don't let the year end without Black Thought spitting the greatest freestyle," which I think is even underselling it at the time. And we knew that, and we came back and covered his conversation with Fallon, covered a lot of it more. But it was an incredible moment. And then you're right, like you do something like that, you get the attention like that. So it's only right that approximately 6 months later, at a time when the Roots are not releasing albums, you step forth with a Grammy-winning producer, a great producer, and shock the world with your first solo project, Streams of Thought.
Yeah, so he comes out with that first song with Ninth, and was Royce? Who else was on
Styles P.
Styles P was on that too. And then follows up like within a few months of that same year with Salaam Remi, who's famous from working with the Fugees and
Amy Winehouse
and tons of other people, but
Inni Kamosi, yeah,
producer himself, yeah. So two quality EPs in the same year. So he goes from 0 to 100 like real quick, slows down a little bit. Streams of Thought 3 comes out in 2020, which is not slow given that, really we're talking about a year and change from those first two, and that was with Sean C. And the interesting thing is that he's not working with, the obvious choices, right? So Ninth Wonder and he, I think, had worked together in the past, but not a ton of stuff.
Right.
And so that's a real surprise. Salaam Remi also, they all make sense sonically when you step back and think about it, but they're not the first people you think of when you think about like doing a project for Black Thought.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Ninth seemed a little familiar, and there was a headline that we ran. There was a report at one point, and I forget who we sourced, but there was, the Roots have been working on an album, or so the public's been told, for a number of years. And there was a period of time where we reported those two names, Ninth Wonder and Salam Remy, were jumping in to work with the Roots. And yes, I mean, over the years, you've had Scott Storch, who was at one time a member. You've had Jay Dilla. You've had different producers come in as part of those ensembles. But that was a moment for a lot of fans of thinking of like, wow, you're having these established producers that we know and trust work with this band that we hold in the highest. Like, what is that going to sound like? We didn't get our answer in the way that we thought. We got it alone with Tariq. And that was really interesting. And yeah, I mean, by the time you get to Sean C, which was all of those albums sound different one to the next. But in 2020, that arrived in the pandemic, and kind of had some of the uncertainty that was going on in the world. I love that album the year that it released. And it was very rocky. Like, it had a lot of rock in there and a lot of like, melody and things like that. So it was cool. It was like watching, Black Thought. The emphasis on collaboration and coming out with something different each time was definitely there.
Yeah. And then in 2022, we get another couple of albums. I think one of the most surprising ones to me was the Danger Mouse album, Cheat Codes, and we both had that in our best of the year album list last year, without question.
Mm-hmm.
Danger Mouse, famous for remixing Jay-Z's Black Album, the Gray Album, and
Gnarls
Barkley and Broken Bells. Some really, who I saw at South by Southwest perform that album when it first came out, was super dope. But Danger Mouse, like, again, just like a really left choice, out of left field kind of choice of who I'm going to work with. And then Femi Kuti, you mentioned that.
I have it wrong in the document, but it's actually
Sean Kuti. So, yeah, Sean or Sean Kuti album. African Dreams. That one to me sonically made a lot of sense because it was Afrobeat, and you can hear that evolution in Black Thought, and like the Roots will kind of go in that direction. Is very, very musical album, but very different than the Danger Mouse album. The Danger Mouse album was dark and somber. This one was really lively and vivacious. It just showcases his diversity.
Yeah, and it was, to your point about Gloria's Game. I mean, it was less than 20 minutes long. I think it was more like 12. I mean, it's just an in and out project, but very conceptual. And when I think of Black Thought's skills, I always think of like, a very syncopated flow and the way Black Thought wraps around the drums. Like, I was a fan of the Roots in the 90s, but my aha moment was Thought at Work on Phrenology, to like watch him take the incredible bongo band, Apache, and just finesse that. And you saw that in the Chappelle DVD, the Block Party too, of like when I can't think of an MC, and we're living in the era of like drumless beats, right? But the way that Thought, and it's only right to have that chemistry that you spoke of him and Amir, because the way that he works to the drums is phenomenal. So
absolutely
came alive on that.
So since 2020, he's taken a break from the Streams of Thought albums and created two more projects, three now, with the Michels Affair project. But he says in that interview that he has too many albums in the works right now to name. So when he says 20 projects simultaneously, but with 20 different producers, you kind of start to think he might actually not be exaggerating. And so one of the things he broke, some really incredible news, is that Streams of Thought Volume 4 is actually done. And not only is it done, one of the interesting things about this album, and I think the Cheat Codes one, not Cheat Codes, but the Sim Kuti one, is that I don't believe either one of those had features, not MC features at least. They were maybe singers or whatever. But Streams of Thought Volume 4 is like packed with features in a way like we haven't seen a Black Thought project maybe ever. Not Roots, not Black Thought, nothing that he's done. And he named names. So he said Yasin Bey, and he said they have a song I think it's called Renaissance. I can't remember. That is, he said, been in the can for 2 years, but it's going to be game changing when it comes out. He says it's going to shift the game. Like, big words, right? Pharoah Monch, Fabulous, Redman, Rick Ross, Big Crit, Currency, Toby and Wigway, Saba, and JID, to name a few. Like, I mean, that is just a murderer's row of lyricists. And, for Black Thought, such an all-star compilation. Got to think that he said it could come at any time. So, given his pattern of the last few years of like maybe taking a year off and then dropping two in the same year, I think it's pretty fair to assume that that one's going to come out this year. But what was your reaction, and what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I liked it, and I had to remember you mentioned the Tiny Desk with El Michels Affair, and one of the best songs of 2019, which pre-pandemic feels like a lifetime ago, was Education, which had Gibbs and Madlib and Yasin Bey and Black Thought. I mean, we covered it on the site. But to see this feature, I totally agree. And the Roots have had albums in later years that had Blue and Fonte and different people in the mix, even Rising Down with Yasin Bey and Styles P. But this one, it does sound really, really special, and I wholeheartedly agree. I have a feeling we get this in Q3 or Q4. And I love the fact I hate it as a media person, but I love the fact of a surprise release. Like, that just keeps fans on the edge of their seats. Is every Thursday I'm like, what's coming out tomorrow? To never be ready. I love that. Like, you could wake up to it tomorrow.
Yeah. And like the other ones, again, a producer who would not be an obvious choice. It goes by the name of 14 KT. And KT worked on Elzhi's Lead Poison, Sky Zoo, Diamond District. He is from Michigan, claims Detroit. But he has been, he's a great producer, obviously, but not someone that you would necessarily, that wouldn't be like probably in the first 5 or 10 names you would mention when you think about who's going to produce the next Black Thought project.
No, I mean, we've covered him on the site a number of times, but I didn't see that coming. And yeah, it was actually James Poyser, who's one of the founding members of the Soulquarians, and I believe now an official member of the Roots, and comes from kind of that Jazzy Jeff art of touch of jazz pedigree. But he said to, I guess, Thought, he's like, yo, I met this dude, he's a brilliant producer, he said he's a huge fan, he has this one beat he wants to play for you. And Thought says they chopped it up, he sent the beat, and the song was called Black, and it became the first song the two of them recorded. And then, to your point, Yasin Bey got on it on Streams of Thought 4. And Thought says, and again, like, I think in verse, Black Thought is, very complimentary of himself and very complimentary of his art, as he should be. I've never found him to be one like a West Side Gun that's in interviews like, yo, we're the greatest ever. But Black Thought says it's a timeless classic. It's been in my vault for a couple of years. And like you said, it could come out at any time. So yeah, exciting stuff.
Crazy, man. So I can't wait for that. But now that we're like in the Black Thought, it's almost like a fantasy game in terms of like the different like MCs he's got on this. I had a thought, like, who do you think would be Black Thought's next ideal production partner? Like, so obviously he's worked with greats both on full projects and individual albums, I mean, individual songs. He's worked with Premier, he's worked with almost anyone you can think of. For me, I think about Alchemist would be like, very near the top of my list, because we're talking about like my favorite producer of the moment working with one of my favorite MCs, and both like to work with one other person on projects.
Mm-hmm.
Alchemist has done that several times over the last few years, and Black Thought has too. I think that would be a super, and dark chords and things like that I think would really speak to what Black Thought likes to do. Soulful. Madlib, I think, because he checks a lot of those boxes too, and is, obviously done great work with Freddie Gibbs and Doom and so forth. I think the two of them could make some magic together. Two kind of like out of the box ones for me are Justice League, because Black Thought likes instrumentation. We see that with El Michels Affair. We've seen it with Sun Kuti and obviously the Roots.
So like that Rick Ross type of Justice League.
Yes, not Just Us, not from North Carolina, Justice, League, from Rick Ross, like Aston Martin music and the Lil Wayne song with Jeezy.
I know the one you mean, but I can't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that I think could be epic just because they make epic beats, and I could hear Black Thought just murdering a track. In fact, I could hear him on that Lil Wayne and Jeezy song. I'll look it up in a second, but like I could hear him just absolutely destroying that. And then another one I can think of is Conductor Williams, because again, very dark samples. I think his work with Makami, like the Stellar Ray Theory, songs like that were just phenomenal. And I could hear Black Thought smashing stuff with all those producers. What about you?
Those are all great answers. I won't dispute any of them. One that came to my mind is a guy, who is starting to come back into the scene a bit, High Tech. I mean, I just love the way that High Tech was going about production in the early 2000s, and the stuff he did with Mood and obviously Reflection Eternal, brilliant stuff. I mentioned Bird's Eye View. I'm gonna Static Selecta. I'd love to see them expound on that chemistry big time. And Static, like Alchemist, who you mentioned, is super prolific, always down to work, and I think has gotten even better with time at like, I'm setting aside these beats for this person. Especially coming off of the James Poyser introduction, I would love to see Jazzy Jeff and Black Thought. I think that Philly could use that, and Black Jeff has always had his solo series, and I know he did he's done that project with Rhyme Fest, but I would love to see Jeff fully in his Philly hip hop roots with a rhyme partner, and I think Thought and Jeff could be huge. And I'll give you one more, and this one might be a little bit of a reach, but it makes sense to me for the same reasons you said. Justice League, live instrumentation. I'd love to see Black Thought with Organized Noise. And those guys, Sleepy, Rico Wade, and Ray Murray have been, they put out an EP late last year. They're doing stuff. They're around, and I would love to see, we saw what they've done with Andre 3000, another phenomenal GOAT level MC. So why not Tariq Trotter?
Man, I think Organized Noise would be epic, especially if they tap back into that initial Outkast sound. Would be incredible. Even like In Due Time, like Organized Noise, just the soulful bass line, just crazy. The song I was thinking about was Luxury Tax with Lil Wayne, Rick Ross, and Jeezy. It just Justice League just demolished that. So another one I think that is more obvious, but I think they could go in down an unobvious road is DJ Premier. Obviously he worked with him and Royce on Prime, and I think a couple other times. But hearing what Premier did for Ab Soul on Gotta Rap, and then hearing what that translated into on NPR's Tiny Desk with the horns, and like I could hear them just going in an epic direction. So. But whatever it may be, I hope that some of these guys are part of the 20 that Thought is working on, or if not, if he hears this or someone gives him word, I would love to plant a few seeds with some of those,
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. So do you think, we mentioned it at the top, and what that 2017 Flex freestyle meant, is Black Thought still underrated?
I think he is, but for different reasons. I think that he has firmly established himself now outside of the roots, and so he's not overshadowed by the collective, the group, or Quest or whoever. But I think that he's done it so well for so long that he's made the exceptional look effortless. I think that it's like how people got used to Michael Jordan, and how if he only scored 28, that he had a bad game. For most people, 28 is a great game, but for Jordan, it was not only not great, but subpar. It was below average for him, literally. I think that Black Thought has set the bar so high for himself with stuff like that freestyle, with references to Dostoevsky and esoteric philosophers in the same sentence, with Richard Pryor movies and stuff like that. Like
I never saw,
yeah. I think if people were to step back and really acknowledge what this man does day in and day out, on top of producing plays and being part of the house band for Jimmy Fallon, and teaching classes and all the things that he does, for him to still be rapping at this level and be getting even better at it and at this pace, I think that again he should be in the top 5 discussion 50% of the time. I don't know, but I get the sense that he's in that discussion 10% of the time. You know what I mean? Like that's just my knee jerk thought. But I still think that he's underrated by those standards, meaning that he should be in the GOAT discussion in earnest for the majority of people. Well, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's still underrated in the sense that I wish people would do what they did for Jay-Z's Khaled verse, for a Black Thought verse. I think we saw a glimpse of what that could look like in 2017 of like, wow, let's analyze these, whether it was 13 or 17 minutes. But I think that, I know some people get fatigued with the GOAT conversation sometimes, but one of the reasons why I believe it needs to happen as often as it does and why folks like you and I will continue to have it is to amplify the argument. And I think that it's there. The proof is in the pudding. I think Black Thought is a little less underrated every day. I think it's not him changing, it's the culture and the listeners catching up to him. And, I say that about Jay and Khaled, but a Dissect podcast, if you really pay attention on what this man is doing, it's all there. It's all there 100%. And it's going to continue to pay dividends, that GOAT level status.
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned Jay Dilla and, Black Thought, working with him. One of the first interviews we ever did with him, the first I did with him was at Dilla Week back in 2016, where I talked to him, and this is on our YouTube too. He gave an amazing story about New Year's Day with Jay Dilla, basically, where it was the day where there's a caravan of artists who would go and, go to Jay Dilla's house in his basement and basically just be there waiting to get first dibs on beats that he made. He handed out beat tapes and first come, first serve of those donuts. And so that was an amazing, amazing story. And we got a deeper glimpse into Jay Dilla's life recently. Last week, a Hulu documentary dropped, which I want to talk about that, man. So first of all, like having read Dan Charnas's book, Dilla Time, it is one of the greatest music books I've ever read.
Facts.
One of the greatest books I've read. It is so incredibly well researched and thoughtfully written, in that not only does it tell the story of Jay Dilla's life, and it's a complicated story, and he tells it warts and all, it also tells about how Dilla made up a completely new form of music theory. So it's Dilla Time, like his time, his musical time. Phenomenal book. So having read that, I was going to go into any documentary with very, very high standards. But before I get into what I thought, I want to hear what your thought was on it.
Yeah, I mean, that book, we talked about it last year on the podcast. Dan Charnas' book is a must-own for any hip-hop fan. And if you are a casual Dilla fan or, love hip-hop, but just admit that you're not up on his greatness, even more reason to own it. Phenomenal must-own book. And yeah, I mean, this documentary has been out a few days before I watched it. And it's on Hulu. It's through FX Productions, but it's also in tandem with the New York Times. And they've done a series of kind of 1 hour plus documentaries. My fiance last year, I guess it might have been the year before, wanted to watch. There was some going on. The what's the word? The like Britney Spears Control. What was the term everyone was using?
Oh yeah, that she was signed to her. I'll think of it. Yeah,
her father. But yeah, so we conservatorship. So I watched that, and I'm just a documentary junkie. So I've watched some of the other things, but I was surprised that there was something on Dilla. But I came into it probably like you with because I mean, just coming off of a Black Thought discussion, I know that 215 Productions, Questlove and Black Thought's company, as well as Joseph Patel, who worked on Summer of Soul, Jazzbo, they're all working, and it's been announced on Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, an upcoming Dilla documentary of sorts. And this one kind of seemed like to pop up. So I came into it, and I'll say this with like um a little bit of, I can't say skepticism, but just like this is interesting. But that's how you felt too?
That's how I felt too. And you know, one of the things like that kind of set the tone for me was that I put in Dilla in the Hulu search, and there was
Same thing.
nothing that came up. It was not until CJ, my girlfriend, said you got to put in
New York
NE.
Times. Oh,
I put in NE for New York Times, right? And to its credit, like I put in NE and it pulled up New York Times. But like for a Dilla documentary to not come up under Dilla or J, you had to put NE. Like, how would you even know that? Like, there's
yeah.
not an NE in the man's name. It was crazy. And so that's how I started watching, but then I also, having read the book, it felt to me like it took massive leaps. There was a lot of stuff missing. To me, Dilla's life would need to be a 5-part docuseries at minimum, given like how complex the book was. I thought it was notable that Dan was not part of it. They used a lot of stock footage, and repeatedly they had this, kind of reel of tape showing like multiple times throughout. It seemed to me like they didn't get a lot of people that were critical to Dilla's life, and for some people they got a lot of Red Bull media footage, like for
Q-Tip and Ali Shaheed Muhammad.
Q-Tip and Ali Shaheed Muhammad. Like, it seemed to me like they were on a very, very modest budget, and it showed. That doesn't take away from the people who were in it, because it did get some great people, and I know you can talk to that. But for me, I was disappointed. I saw some photos I'd never seen before, but not a ton, maybe one or two, and even the photos they used repeatedly also. There's some cool footage of the Soulquarians that I'd never seen, of a famous photo shoot.
Yeah.
But man, I left feeling wanting more, and feeling a little bit underserved.
I I would echo that personally. What I liked about it, for me, a lot of those photos I hadn't seen, and Dill is always a challenge to find photos of. I never knew James. I used to communicate with Hex Murder, who people know through Random Acts, Sean Price and Black Milk. But he would say like, Dilla read this article and he liked it. Like, I remember those conversations in the like 2003, 2004. What I liked about the film was talking about Dilla's role in the Ummah, which is something I never knew. I mean, I knew that he played a role in it, but I never knew the complexities of that until I read Dan Charnas's book, and I believe a lot of that came from that book. So that was interesting. Raphael Sadiq is one of the people that did interviews, and I completely, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I forgot that he was part of that production unit. I always think of it as Tip, Ali, and Dilla, but I forgot that Raph was there, Ray. That part was interesting. I thought it was interesting. There was a business aspect. Some of the members of Dilla's legal team appear, and they speak about just how in arrears his estate was after he passed. And I sensed that was part of the impetus in the New York Times getting behind this, coming off of the Britney Spears conservatorship stuff. But yeah, I mean, it was interesting to learn of a guy that was making $65,000 to $75,000 a track in the early 2000s, but also, kind of like backdooring songs for, sometimes a couple grand. And that was part of what I think made Dilla dope. He would be working with guys like Fat Cat, who he came up with, and, Frank and Dank, and all these different people at the same time. He's doing Grammy nominated stuff with Common, or stuff with the Roots or Busta Rhymes. So that was interesting. But yeah, there were big gaps. They never mention Madlib's name. They never mention Peanut Butter Wolf's name. They never mention Stone's Throw. They do talk about Donuts. There was a big
Talk about his kids until like the last like 30 seconds. Yeah.
the very end. And here's what I sense. And I don't, infinite love and respect to Maureen Ma Dukes Yancey. I actually got, a bit choked up when she was recounting Dilla's last minutes. That's a heavy, heavy thing. But when you're dealing, we've seen the same thing with Tupac's legacy when Afeni was alive, and Biggie's legacy with his mom. I have a feeling that there's a bit, in order to speak and get access to some of the folks. Dilla's sister, his brother Illa J is in it. You know, obviously you're going to leverage some of the narrative, and I thought it was an interesting watch. I don't regret watching it, but I didn't leave with the sense of, is satiation the word? I wasn't satisfied like I was, or surprised when I read Dan's book.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and to your point, they did get some great interviews, right? Like, so having Ma Dukes is crucial. You can't do a Dilla documentary without her. So that was great. It's great to see Black Milk on there.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Nitti, Fat Cat, House Shoes was on there. Illa J, John Yancey.
Jazzy Jeff is incredible.
Yeah,
like,
Jazzy
and he
Jeff was incredible.
He recreates some samples, which I thought was really cool. Because I mean, like, to your point of having to search this through the New York Times, in a lot of ways, this film is like, I imagine my parents, and I think it was a little bit esoteric, just in terms of you need to know the hip hop universe to watch this, to appreciate these figures in this context. But the way that they showed Dilla's sampling techniques with Jazzy Jeff lays out, I really appreciated that. I mean, I knew where those records came from, but to watch Jeff's jubilation and showing his admiration, especially as somebody who worked with Slum Village very early in their career, I really, really, really appreciated that. And you mentioned a lot of the stock footage. Much of the documentary is built around a 2004 interview that Dilla did in Sweden. I'd never heard that interview, and Dilla, I mentioned Black Thought and Premier kind of being artists that came into the spotlight. For as phenomenal as Dilla is, he was never like an interview guy. He was somebody who really didn't like, and they showed in the doc, like, stopped really going to New York, shunned so much of that. So to hear a very lucid, delighted, powerful interview like that was really cool.
Yeah, Jazzy Jeff was great. Probably one of my favorite parts of the documentary as a whole. Definitely challenging to do a documentary on Dilla because, to your point, there's not a ton of footage on him, and there's also not a lot of photos out there. I think that overall it was okay, but like I said, in the backdrop of the book that we had, and also knowing how many people were not part of it or were done so through stock footage, took it down like a few notches for me. But if you're a Dilla fan, I don't think you would skip it. I just think you go on with your expectations managed, and it is what it is.
Yeah, and that's happened to me with like being a Death Row and a Tupac fan numerous times. I'll see something and I can't wait for. It was funny. I have the cheaper version of Hulu where I feel like I get ads every 7 minutes, and every one of those ads was for Dear Mama, the upcoming Tupac joint, and I'm really excited to see that.
They did have a lot of people who were there with him throughout the journey, family members, Frank Nitti, House Shoes, like people who were there with him from the beginning were pretty strongly represented. So I thought that part was dope.
Yeah, good point. And also, I mean, I never paid too much attention to the Dilla estate stuff, but I know I've watched it happen in real time, as you may have too. Like, a lot of the releases, the posthumous stuff will be on the DSPs and then get pulled, and sometimes I'll see a headline about management and Ma Dukes and just speaking about mishandlings. And it is really sad to know that Dilla was a father of two, and they say like they were never received a cent from his estate until recent years, when this man died. Like Tupac, like a lot of other artists, he was in a great deal of debt. And when somebody that is rising to greatness passes away, the powers that be, i.e. attorneys and the Internal Revenue Service, pop up and they say, well, where was all this money? Where's the paper trail? When you talk about somebody who's working in their basement that might be taking literally like, 5,000 in a bag for a beat, that's going to cause, and it's just hard for me, once again, to see a tremendous Black artist whose heirs have not benefited from that, and that's really sad. And it seems like it's working its way better, but I just hope that Dilla's family, from his mom to his kids, continue to reap the fruits of his genius.
Yeah, the Dan's book obviously gets into that to a very large degree. I think it's close to 100 pages or so dedicated to Dilla posthumously, maybe even more than that. And he just released a paperback edition that goes into it even more extensively. But it was very complicated, very messy, as unfortunately these things tend to be. And but yeah, documentary was very, very light on all of that.
For sure, for sure. So what else caught your eye this week?
So another person who was in the news is Snoop Dogg, who is not often out of the news. Snoop has been in the news pretty consistently since 1992 when Deep Cover came out. But this was more of a retrospective look at his entire life in the early days, in particular, by someone who was there at the beginning of his career and is as much of a West Coast OG as he is. And that was Big Boy, legendary on-air personality on radio in LA. Got really the full like Snoop interview. His goal is to get untold stories, those things that people haven't heard before, and he definitely succeeded in this one. Heard a bunch of stuff that we'd never heard before. Some examples are that Snoop slept in his car for 2 months when he was 17. I had no idea about that. A lot of times we get the Snoop story, when he and Warren G and Nate Dogg are in 213 and, trying to get their tape to Dr. Dre and so forth. And the story kind of begins there. But, to hear that Snoop was not only out of the house at age 17, but sleeping in his car for 2 months was pretty crazy for me.
Yeah, what I liked about the interview too, I will say this is the definitive like YouTube era interview with Snoop. I always enjoyed GGN. I always liked to watch Snoop just kind of fly off the cuff, sitting there smoking with a guest, and he would just drop jewels. We covered a lot of them on AFH. But this one, recently when J. Cole sat down with the Golden State Warriors GM Bob Myers, you and I were talking about how hip hop is kind of losing its foothold of interviewing its superstars. And, the Drakes and the Kendricks and the Coles are going kind of outside the culture. And it was DJ Academics that had a huge problem with that. And we discussed it. And this is a great reminder. You're not going to get this interview with anybody outside. Like Big Boy knows the score. He knows the context. He's been covering Snoop for, like you said, all of these years. And it really is an intimate conversation that's for the public. Like Big Boy asks, as I'm listening, I listened yesterday during a 6-hour drive. Every time I'd hear something, Big Boy followed up with the question I wanted to hear. And Snoop was not rushed. He wasn't like, it is filmed, but he's not like playing for the cameras. It's a great documentary conversation. And Snoop even said some really interesting things about like his wife, who is very much part of his business, and has been, for at least 25 years. And Snoop even says like when they were dating, it took them quite some time to get their relationship to the next level. And we all think of Snoop as this like guy who's inspired by Superfly and all of these different, characters that might not have hurdles with women. And he explains, he's like, I wanted her to be my wife because she made me wait, and it made me trust her differently. And he speaks about, how aggressive Nate Dogg was back in the day, and really just talks about those early days of 213 and his nervousness around Dr. Dre, which sounds like he says Dr. Dre came to Warren's house to play what is it, Easier Said Than Done? Is that the joint?
No, Easy Does It.
Easy Does It.
No, yeah, Easy Does It. Yep.
And how Snoop was just hoping the entire time that Warren wasn't going to say, my man here raps. And it was hilarious. I'm laughing as I listen because eventually Warren, who we know to be the like exuberant, like enthusiastic, like let's make this happen. Hey, yo, Andre, my man. And Dre's like, yeah, I got to go get something to eat. I'm laughing as I listen to that. Just a truly, truly, truly phenomenal interview with a lot of heart and soul.
Yeah, and it was cool to hear like inside dope on like the dynamics with him and Warren and Nate Dogg. Like you said, Nate Dogg was out of the three of them the most gangster, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Even though he was a dude singing. But he also talked about how protective Warren G was of him. And, because Warren G was so territorial with Snoop, he actually had kind of a little bit of tension and friction with Nate Dogg, Warren G, that is, because he wanted to make sure that, he knew that, he was like Snoop's number one dog, and then he talked about how Snoop actually wanted to give up at one point. You know, he had gone to some meeting. They said they wanted him to sound more like DJ Quick. And he came back and he threw all of his rhymes away, his entire collection of rhymes he'd written. And supposedly Warren G fished him out of the trash and literally refused to let Snoop quit. So just even hearing stuff like that Snoop was considering bouncing, and if not for Warren G, we might have never even heard of them, was really crazy. But I think one of the craziest stories was Snoop had a deal on the table and he was going to sign that deal. It was a Friday. They said, listen, come to the studio on Monday. We'll get it going. And then, something happened over the weekend, which changed the course of West Coast rap history. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great setup. So one of the things I've never realized is that, Snoop was around Ruthless to a point. Warren G, as a young budding producer, had made, Dre is still at Ruthless, although kind of acrimoniously, has already kind of one foot out the door and is doing things on the side that doesn't sound like Eazy-E and Jerry Heller were aware of, in terms of just creatively speaking, the early iterations of Death Row. And I think the DOC is very much part of that. But Snoop is being a hanger on and coming to the studio as a member of this group that's selling, I don't even know if they were selling them, but like hustling tapes around Long Beach. And he's sitting on the couch. And one of the big groups in like 1991, or one of the big acts on Ruthless, was Above the Law. At that point, I believe they've already put out an album and an EP. And, geniusly, Ruthless has positioned Big Hutch, the kind of the front man of ATL, to be the next Dre. Like we saw something similar later on with Dre and Daz, but like he's producing some of the joints around and starting to build a team around him as they're working on their next big project. And Snoop, being this guy on the couch, was kind of, like, hey, little homie, we're going to get you on a song. And Snoop talks about this in the interview. I've heard Hutch speak of this. I interviewed Hutch for Ambrosia like 2016, but I've never heard Snoop speak on it before. And, he says that at the time, it was an offer, but it was tepid. And Snoop puts it in perspective. Like Above the Law is on, but they also have Cocaine, who's also from Pomona, and, kind of like family to those guys. So he's next. But hey, we're building this album and we want to give you a feature. And we've seen this in hip hop. I mean, you think of, Live at the Barbecue, you've got Nas, you've got Joe Fatal, you've got Akinelli. Like in the early 90s, a feature you could do a lot with it, but it didn't always guarantee something. And, at that same time, they were like, come to the studio Monday. Over the weekend is when, and I think a lot of hip hop fans have heard this story, Warren G is kind of DJing a pool party for Dre and slides in something from Snoop or 213. And Dre stops what he's doing, presumably having a good time, says, play that again. And it ultimately culminates in Dre on that same Monday saying, bring your man to the studio. And let's remember what I just said of some years prior, Snoop being nervous around Dre. But Snoop said, and I'm paraphrasing, but like ultimately
Dre got him on the phone that Sunday night.
Yeah, he didn't even believe it.
Yeah, it's like, yo, come to the studio tomorrow. And so he had 2 invitations to come to the studio at the same day, but he accepted one.
He accepted one. And, ultimately, I think it had to do with the fact, and Snoop alludes to it, and I really appreciate this, because I think we've all had these situations where you're kind of like out there like, hey, I'm here. And somebody's showing interest, but maybe not the interest that you feel you deserve in whatever capacity, professional, personal. And Dre now shows interest. And Snoop said, well, surely, if you would want me Monday, Tuesday will be cool, when he goes and does his thing with Dre. And what I loved about this interview, and what I didn't say previously, is, I've mentioned Black Thought being able to pull up that verse at the De La event. Snoop, despite all of the cannabis, is able in this interview to remember the exact rhymes and spit them perfectly to stuff that we've heard and stuff that we haven't, but the very rhymes that changed his career and got him noticed. And in that turn of events, going to be with Dre instead of ATL on that Monday is what ultimately, leads to Deep Cover, and boom, here we are.
Yeah, it is another sliding door moment that would have absolutely changed West Coast history. We don't know if there would have even been a deep cover. Like the future of Death Row Records might have been completely different, because you think about the impact that Snoop had on the Chronic, and then obviously Doggy Style, and then the Dog Pound, and so forth. Like, it would have potentially. You don't even know if Dr. Dre. I don't want to be just hyperbolic about it, but you don't even know if Dr. Dre becomes Dr. Dre. You know, he's done it so many times, but we've seen he's not foolproof. You know, people think of 2001 being the first Aftermath release, but it wasn't. You know, the compilation album was not very good. You know, it had Been There, Done That, and that was pretty much it. Even The Firm didn't do well. You know, so, and that was with established superstar MCs. So I think you cannot say enough about how important Snoop was to the legacy of Death Row, and obviously Dr. Dre as well.
Well, and he does, it's interesting. And, he says he went to the Solar Building, which, put out the soundtrack for Deep Cover and, ultimately provided some, certainly exposure, but reportedly some seed money to what would become Death Row. And Deep Cover, Snoop originally approached as if he was writing for Dre, as others had during NWA. And ultimately, and he's very complimentary of Suge Knight as well as Dre, at some point in the turn of events decided, like, no, you're going to rap on it too. And Snoop, it's just such a good story, says that in the third verse, he approaches Dre and was like, we're going to rap the third one together. And Dre's on board. And the video, Snoop originally thought he was showing up for a photo shoot, only to discover the video. And it's phenomenal. But the interesting subtext here is, that coincides with obviously a very acrimonious exit for Dre at Ruthless, on the Chronic.
Yeah, one other thing about Deep Cover, a crazy story that he talks about is that the song wasn't even finished. And he talks about what a hustler Suge Knight was, because Suge had the Sony executives, Sony put out the soundtrack for Deep Cover, on the phone, told them the record was done, and had Snoop get on the phone and rap the last verse to it, rap a verse to it, and cut him off like, mid verse. Snoop was basically freestyling just to like prove that the song was done, even though it wasn't. But like, that was the hustle that Suge had, that Snoop respected, and maybe this is where you're going. But he gave his flowers to Suge pretty prominently in the interview too.
He did, and Snoop admits that. I mean, that song, whenever I think of it, I hear the chorus, 187 on an undercover cop. Snoop said that he was busted by an undercover. I mean, at that point in his life, that sleeping in his car era into his early 20s, he was in and out of, correctional facilities. And he was like, I knew the premise of the movie. I knew, and he was able to write from his reality and probably exaggerate elements of it. But that, like, I started, like, that coincides with Dre's exit, and Dre's exit marks, the nail in the coffin of NWA. Cube had already left a year or two earlier, and you start to see that on the Chronic and Eazy-E's, it's on Dr. Dre EP. They started dissing each other. And the second time, you see Snoop within months of this, and he's dissing Eazy-E in the, F with Dre Day video and on that song. What's interesting is, and AFH has covered this, that those two groups, there's a lot of argument and debate over the architecture of G-Funk. And the album that I presume that Snoop would have recorded to, whether or not he made it, is Black Mafia Life, which came out in early 1993. That album has Tupac on it. And, just a few weeks and months before that, Dre puts out The Chronic. And there's a couple of places on those albums that they use the same sample. Black Mafia Life has a song, Never Missing a Beat, which has the same funkadelic, not just knee deep sample as F with Dre Day. And there's another case too. The song Pimp Clinic has the same refrain, the swing down sweet chariot, as Dr. Dre's Let Me Ride. I mean, both of those Dre songs were big singles from that album with videos. And in the middle, you have Warren G, who's also part of G-Funk and, really shines by the time you have Ain't No Fun and Regulate. And Above the Law, let's be real, I love that group. I listen to them all the time, but they never, Death Row's ascent comes at a time where Above the Law has kind of reached a bit of a plateau, and Above the Law ends up leaving Ruthless. And it's what really cool in the interview is Big Boy asked the question. They talk about, again, this is insider hip hop knowledge. And it's discussed of like even the chorus, Snoop says 187 on Undercover Cop. Well, Big Hutch's name that he used throughout his career as an alias was Cold 187. So it's like in the era of subliminals where you have Kane and Rakim dropping these lines that might mean something to one another, is Snoop getting on to kind of throw a snub at ATL. And, it's wild too, because Snoop says like he coached Hutch's son in football years later. Like they're great friends. Both of those guys worked together on the Dr. Dre Compton album in 2015. Cocaine, the guy who was next in line for Above the Laws, their protege, ends up singing uncredited vocals on the Chronic. Like there's all of these different universes going on. And you and I are big on like what if moments and sliding doors, as you said earlier. And it just makes you wonder, like, what would have happened if Snoop would have gone to ATL on Monday, or had Dre not shown up that Monday? Like, entire universes as we know it in hip hop could have changed.
Yeah, I don't see the 187 as a snub just because that was the police code for murder, but
Right.
the rest of it is wild, and it makes you, even though the album, the Above the Law album, came out a couple months later, doesn't mean that those songs weren't recorded and floating around long before. And so, I'm sure that's a point of controversy, but that's wild. And the fact that he could have been more closely affiliated with Ruthless than with Death Row, like, just again, it just changes the whole trajectory of it.
Well, presumably, I mean, Snoop says he witnessed the DOC and the Eazy-E get into an altercation, and he's very cagey about who won, but he kind of implies that Eazy won. And I appreciate just the rawness of that element, but it leads me to believe, like, one of the things I've always wondered is, like, F with Dre Day, I always imagine Snoop as this guy who's, like, dissing somebody he's never met, which we've seen throughout, rap history, like, of people getting on, whether you're talking about Roxanne Shante and UTFO on down. And now I'm realizing, like, doesn't mean it was a big exchange, but Snoop and Eazy-E had at least been in rooms together before that song comes out. And it's wild. It's interesting to me. And the one other thing I'll say is, like, you talked about who would be a great producer for Black Thought. Snoop Dogg is incredibly prolific, and we've seen him do even one-offs with producers. And oftentimes his albums are built around a small ensemble. I would love to see a Warren G produced Snoop Dogg album. And I think it's one of the things, Snoop has obviously right now working on an album with Dre, they both say, called Missionary. Years ago, Snoop had flirted with the idea of like Doggy Style 2. I would love to see that album. I think there's so much history there. I think that there are a lot of producers that sometimes lose their original sound or veer too far away from it. But I think Warren G is a great exception, and I think he is perfectly capable of making the kind of Snoop Dogg album. Like, as much as I'm looking forward to this Dre and Snoop one, like, make no mistake, that is my most anticipated album of the moment. Knowing how much Snoop works, I'd love to see that happen. And knowing their history, which is colored in this interview, that would be a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I mean, we saw, part of it with that 213 album they released, right? Like, I don't know how much Warren produced on that, but there was some joints on that. It didn't live up to the hype that I think people were looking for, but, they definitely did collab, pretty substantially on that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would love to see that. As I'm seeing it's got High Tech was a producer on it, DJ Pooh, Knots, some pretty dope producers. Ironically, Warren is not producing on that project.
Yeah.
To your point, I would think Missy Elliott's a producer on it. Yeah, I would think that he would have produced most of that, but yeah.
We got to ask Warren, or we got to ask Snoop about that. And I want to do it very respectfully, but I've always been curious about that, because it's like, I always thought Pimp C was such a great producer. And then at some point, UGK got so big that they brought outside producers. We've seen that with RZA. We've seen that with Muggs and Cypress Hill. And, in the Warren case, it just, like, his albums, I mean, he's put out stuff recently and it still sounds so good. I don't necessarily need to know why it didn't happen, but I'd love to. And sadly, Nate's obviously not here. I would like to see more of those guys working together.
And to going back to the controversies that are part of the past, one of the claims has always been that Warren G did a lot of ghost producing on Doggy Style. And if you listen to It Ain't No Fun, that is, like, to me, like 100% a Warren G beat, even though I think Daz is credited. But if I think if you go back and look at Doggy Style, you'll probably hear some strong Warren G influence at the very
Yeah.
least. You know?
Yeah. For sure.
So a couple other things he said that were really interesting to me, and we've covered this too, but it might be new to folks who are newer to us, is that the first night he ever met Tupac was at a movie rap party. I forget what film it was.
I think Poetic Justice.
Was it Poetic Justice? And so he and Pac, the first time they met was on stage, basically. Someone was about to give him the mic and give Snoop the mic, and Tupac jumped up on stage and grabbed the mic and started rapping, and then Snoop got it and he started rapping too, and they basically were battling each other. And afterwards they were outside, and Snoop gave Pac gave Snoop his first ever blunt, and Pac said that or Snoop said that it like basically knocked him off his feet, which was pretty funny to hear. And he says some pretty sad stuff too. He says that up until about a week before Tupac died, he and Pac were, nearly best friends. But, within 2 days of Tupac's death, they had gone to New York shortly before that, flown back. There's a story he tells, it's told many times about like how tense the plane ride was. But Snoop was still cool with the guys from Bad Boy effectively. Even though Tupac was embroiled in his battle, Snoop wasn't trying to get down with that. And he said some things on the radio to that effect. And he got iced out by Suge and Tupac. And so the very last thing that their very last interaction, Tupac just kind of like waved him off and walked away to his car. And that was the last time he saw him conscious. Pretty epic stories. But again, Big Boy, incredible listen. Definitely check that one out too.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the best interviews I've heard this year. And Snoop is somebody who does a lot of press. So when you can say that about somebody who's told their story so many times, it says a lot.
Have you ever met Snoop?
I did. I actually, and I was reaching for it, not within an arm's reach. I have a cover story I did for The Source in 2008. And I went to the W Hotel on, I think, Lexington, you would know, and interviewed Snoop on, it was funny, like I got the assignment less than 24 hours before I went. He had just put out that very week Ego Trippin'. So literally I went to Best Buy in South Philly, bought the CD, drove to New York, studied up, and interviewed him. Must have been on a Tuesday night. And in that room, Snoop traveled with a whole private plane, a whole entourage. Was DJ Quick, Teddy Riley, Daz, No Corrupt, Superfly, Bishop Don Magic Juan, and one or two other people. Mr. Fab and Too Short. And it was crazy. And he had done Conan. He had begun partying. I'm telling you the abbreviated version. And he got to the room, and I had to write a cover story. They knew that Snoop had the cover. My editor at The Source, Ryan Ford, who to this day works with Snoop Dogg and at the Cashmere Agency. And I had the photographer, who's a famed hip hop photographer, said he wanted to go first before I could ever write, which I think I was a little frustrated by, because I'm thinking you're pushing my time with this artist further and further away. And it was getting late into the night, like after midnight. And they took a bunch of photos with Snoop, and Snoop said, could you please not use flash bulbs? Like, I'm high, they're bugging me. And Snoop, as you know, probably we all have all seen it one time or another, got kind of irritable. And I introduced myself earlier in the night. I was like, yo, I'm here to write the story. Snoop was like, cool, whatever. And the photography session went on forever and ever, and they kept using the flash bulbs. And Snoop was like, I'm not doing no interview. I'm going to bed. I'm done with this. And I had to walk up to him, hat in hand, as you say. And I said, Snoop, I promise you this. I've driven a long way to be here. I'm doing this article. I love the album. I have thoughtful questions. I will give you the shortest interview of your career. And Snoop said to me, okay. He says to me, hi, brother. Bye, brother. And he said, that's the shortest interview of my career. Peace. Oh, and he turned around, and then he punked me. Like, he turned around and goes, I said, he smiled, like he was polite, but clearly perturbed with the night. And I said, I will ask you 10 questions. And I pulled out my sheet of paper, because I didn't operate on my phone back then. And I started crossing off questions. I said, these are the questions. He said, let's talk. We stepped over to the window. He had the whole floor of the W, top floor, We stepped over. I had my recorder, and I interviewed him. And I said, I looked at my watch. This is a cover story for The Source, and while The Source wasn't what it once was, it was still a monthly, very high-profile magazine.
What year is this again?
2008.
Okay.
And I do my interview. I said, see, and I point to my phone and I go, I was 2 minutes over. It was 12 minutes. And Snoop, I asked him hard questions. And I said, I got to make this into a cover story. And Snoop said, all right, thank you. And I'll reach for the door. The person I was talking to was Daz and Superfly that night because I was a fan of theirs. And Quick and Teddy Riley were busy. They produced a lot of that album. And I kind of reached for my coat and say my goodbyes. And Snoop said, hey, stop. He said, I want you to know something. That was the best interview I've ever had. And I'm not telling you that because it was 12 minutes. I'm telling you that because you stood in here for 4 hours or whatever it was. You said you didn't say shit. You didn't puff your chest up and try to get it done. You waited your turn and you showed respect to every other person in this room. And the least I could do is tell you that. You asked the right questions. And it's funny. He mentioned, he goes, I always thought it was Kevin Powell, my conversation with him. But he goes, I'm going to give it to this one right now. And man, I got on the elevator. My friend Stacy was waiting for me downstairs. She lived locally. And I drove home just running on pure adrenaline. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I wrote the story through the night. And at noon, I handed it into my editors at The Source. And the funny part is right after I sent it, Snoop's publicist, I think at the time he was still on Geffen, called me. My phone, I had a business line with caller ID at the time, landline phone. And I look and it's Geffen. I'm going, oh, shoot. And she called and she said, hey, I heard it went well. And can I put Snoop through? He wants to talk to you. I said, sure. And Snoop just said, hey, I want you to know something. I smoke a lot of weed, but I meant every word I said last night. And you did a good job. And I said to him one other thing. And I said, man, you know what we got in common? We're both diehard Pittsburgh Steelers fans. And he lit up because that was the year, not to rub it in, but we were on a Super Bowl run later that year. And we bonded, and that was that. And I've never spoken to Snoop since then. I turned in the story. I'll pull it in a second. It's got the LA Lakers covers. It's yellow and purple. The sad truth is I never got paid for it. And, I probably spent several $100s of my own money, but that was when The Source was changing ownership. And the people that were leaving said not it. And the people that now own it said not it. But I did ask my editor for a favor one time for a charity. And Snoop wore some special custom made gloves and took a really dope photo for the charity for me. And I always to me at the time, that money was so necessary to my life, so necessary. And I never got it, but I survived. And I hope to tell Snoop that conversation one day because it meant a lot to my career, for better and worse.
That's crazy. That's a fantastic story. I know you told me that before, but it's always good to hear it. We're still going to work on trying to get you that Source money. I know both the past owners and the current owner. So next time I might mention that. Yeah, I've gotten to meet Snoop twice. Both times were very, very similar in that, he was literally in the middle of a circle of people, 3 or 4 people, not huge group, holding court. And Snoop is like a comedian, when he wants to be. He's one of the most charismatic personal people I've ever encountered. And for literally a half an hour, he just sat there entertaining people, just off the cuff humor, and one was at, it was the first ever Jay-Z Rock Nation brunch. And I was with Stephen Hill, Stephen, Snoop, myself, and maybe 1 or 2 other people. And that was incredible. The other one was at a after Grammy party, the year that Chance won, because Chance was there too. And it was in the back in the patio. The Migos were there. As probably the last time I saw the 3 of them together. Just, things have changed in a major way, of course. But that was the same thing, man. Just holding court, entertaining people. Just a really, really, really charismatic, seemingly great dude, and this interview, I think, showcased that part of him. Not only was he going back and talking about his own life, but was talking about his deep fandom of hip hop, and the legends for him and what it felt like to hear the message for the first time and things like that. It was just really, really well done.
Yeah, I encourage everyone, and we're going to be covering it on the site a little bit with this conversation too.
Yeah. So a couple quick things. This one I found to be interesting. So the Forbes list comes out every year where they talk about what artists have what amount of money. I've been told by people in the know that it is wildly, wildly inaccurate, but in both directions. There's some people on there who don't have anything close to what they're saying, and others who are not on there who are truly, truly like wealthy.
Hmm.
50 Cent says he's been a billionaire since 2007. He did an interview, which looked like it was like more of a paid sponsorship for one of his spirits. And that one was a head scratcher for me because, the vitamin water deal that he did was in 2007. At the time, that brand sold for 4.2 billion, $4.1 billion. People thought that he had a 10% cut of the deal, which would have been 400 million, so that would have made him a 400 million an air plus, I don't know, maybe 100, 200 from other stuff. But it turned out later on that the actual size was more likely to be 100 million. And 50 Cent since then has declared bankruptcy. Some of that is funny money manipulation because he was doing child custody stuff. But for him to say he's a billionaire since 2007, interesting to me. I could see it maybe now with the Power franchise and stuff like that. But one of the things that I found to be particularly ironic is that, like I said, I think this was almost like an infomercial for one of his spirit brands. The fact that 50 Cent sells spirits in and of itself is wild because 50 is a teetotaler. He doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink. To my knowledge, he hasn't for decades, if ever. And he even goes to the point of putting ginger ale in a champagne bottle to swig, and it looked like he had some ginger ale or whatever in the glass on this interview too. But it made me think, Future took a lot of heat recently, maybe in the last couple of years, over promoting lean, the use of lean so much in his music, when the truth was that he had, completely detoxed and stopped doing it for 2 years before that came out. Do we think that that's any different than what 50 is doing with spirits?
I know alcohol kills people in its own way, and it can rip apart families, rip apart lives. I don't see it as the same. You know, 50 also has, and I'm not justifying something with capitalism, although it probably sounds like I am. Like 50 has, deals to sell. He has products to sell. I just listened. There's a stand-up comedian, Ron White, and he's now sober. Had a huge issue with alcohol, and he owns a tequila company. And he still, when he does a stand-up special, gets on stage with a bottle of tequila, but in his glass is a lime and water because he's sober. And he tells the world that 50's never been shy about telling the world he doesn't drink and his fitness regimen. I think that's totally different. I mean, yes, Future named a series of projects Dirty Sprite, but he does not own Sprite. He's not being paid by promethazine and codeine and these products. It is just sheerly out of, trying to appear something you're not. And that has a damaging effect on listeners. And especially, I feel like young and impressionable listeners. So I see that vastly different.
I don't have a problem with him. I think it's ironic that he has a liquor brand, as a person, because it's almost like a drug dealer who doesn't use the product but pushes it onto the people. And I'm in my snowfall bag right now, but I think on some level, the damage that it does, or you think that it does damage, and so you don't do it for yourself because otherwise, why wouldn't you? But I think that where it crosses the line for me is the faking. Like 50 is a person who has always prided himself or portrayed himself as being authentic, right? In his music, in his scripted entertainment, things like that. So I think taking the step of putting ginger ale in a champagne bottle to pretend like you're drinking champagne, or having a prop drink, that to me goes a little bit far. I think that part crosses the line for me. The rest is just, I think, commentary.
One other thing, I did the 2007 Forbes list for Cash Kings with my editor Leah Goldman and some other folks at Forbes, but they brought me in and paid me much more than the source still owes me to to do that article. And it was funny, man. I was 23 years old, and that was the biggest assignment I ever had. And with 50 in particular, I mentioned Jay-Z's line on the I Got Money remix. where you said figure what the Forbes. No, it was another song where you said figure what the Forbes figured, then figure more. But that summer, it was Jay-Z, Puffy, and 50, and we knew that they would all be competing for number one. And then those guys hopped on that joint together. But of all the folks I dealt with, all the big companies, 50 Cent, who was managed at the time by Chris Lighty, rest in peace, was by far the easiest. And I always think of that because I was a very probably in over my head writer and with a very trusted seasoned editor. But I remember you would make estimates. You would get, the same way that they talk in that Dilla documentary of, how much Dilla is earning a track. I was going to Timberland and Scott Storch's people and saying, like, can you tell me what your client makes a song, which no one wants to say, and no one wants that to be published in a really respectable, publication, because then the IRS might be watching and say, well, you did 7 songs and, you're saying this amount of money. So it's very, very, tongue in cheek. But Chris Lighty was always super helpful, and he looked at all of my notes and told me a couple of places that were low, a couple of places that were high, and handed it back to me. And to your point, it might have been totally inaccurate. It could have been, trying to get 50 to the top spot. But I always remember, and it's one of the things you and I have spoken of 50 on this podcast, like of superstar rappers or superstar hip hop artists, I've always found 50 Cent, much like Snoop Dogg, to be a delight to work with and incredibly transparent and just what you hope somebody like that to be. I hear what you're saying about the liquor, but I look at those lists and I've seen the headlines this week kind of taper back. 50 Cent is a billionaire to 50 Cent says he lives a billionaire's lifestyle. So I have my belief that, I'm kind of with you that I don't think so, but who's to say?
Yeah, listening to the whole quote, that's what my takeaway was too. That's what, because he talked about not wanting for anything, being able to do pretty much whatever he wanted to do, which, but very, very different. But he said, I'm a billionaire. I've been a billionaire since 2007. So
yeah.
What else you want to cover?
Man, we've covered so much. I want to say rest in peace to Seymour Stein. I know he passed away a few weeks ago, but I'm a fan of New York City punk rock. A lot of that Sire Records stuff. I've sat on this podcast wearing a Talking Head shirt that I actually bought with you during the pandemic in New York. We hit up a dope merch store in the Lower East Side, and that's what I grabbed. But he passed away, and I think from the hip hop perspective that matters because Sire, Warner Brothers took a real chance on Ice-T, in the mid 1980s, and released and distributed Rhyme Pays and put out Rhyme Syndicate, which introduced the world to Everlast and Dub C and DJ Muggs and a host of different people. So I just thought, as he passed away, I believe he was 80 years old, wanted to acknowledge that. From all that I've heard from Ice, he was a really good record executive and a good guy. And years later, after Cop Killer came out and Warner Brothers no longer wanted to be in business with Ice-T or Body Count, they let Ice walk with his masters and the album that he'd already recorded, which I think became the Home Invasion album.
Well, I got 3 quick things. One is Alan Hughes was on the Breakfast Club, and we talked about Eazy-E earlier. But he said something I'd never heard before, which is that O-Dog, the character, the iconic character in Menace to Society, was actually written for Eazy-E, and that was a real shocker to me. He said, but Eazy and Jerry Heller were, of Ruthless, were too controlling. They wanted to control every aspect, and so that's why that didn't work out. Obviously, similar kind of things happened with Tupac, but we'll talk more about that. He was on promoting his upcoming Dear Mama documentary on Tupac and his mom. And then DJ Cassidy, who brought a lot of joy to folks in 2020, along with D-Nice and Timbaland and Swizz with Versus, with his Pass the Mic series, is doing a live version of that one night only in Radio City in New York City. It's featuring Big Daddy Kane, Rakim, Slick Rick, Dougie Fresh, Black Sheep, Brand Nubian, CL Smooth, EPMD, Moni Love, Special Ed, Roxanne Shante, and many more. So that's something to look forward to. I'm sure we'll talk more about that in the future. And then last but not least, we've covered this in the past. Hip hop, as it is in its 50th year, has crossed a lot of mainstream barriers over the last few years. and getting recognition from different institutions. So the Grammys are giving more recognition. We've gotten Oscars, but one of the big threshold, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, one of the big thresholds was that songs and albums started getting put in the Library of Congress. And that's happened a few times over the years. And the National Registry just announced today, as a matter of fact, that Queen Latifah's All Hail the Queen, her album with Ladies First and, all those great records.
Wrath of My Madness, that's my joint.
Yeah, Wrath of My Madness, just tons of stuff. And so that is going to be placed in the National Registry, the Library of Congress. So salute to her, but pretty awesome.
I love that, especially watching her, with Dilla recently, and just I know you were in the building. That gave me chills. That we interviewed MC8 in one of the first years, in the first year of this podcast, and one of our first guests. And 8 revealed that the AWACS character was originally shopped to Ren. Is that right? Do I have that right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so it's crazy. Like when they made that film, they were thinking of Easy in one role and Ren in another.
Yep.
But
he wanted, he made it clear that in order to get the film greenlit, he had to have known talent associated with it. So without Tupac being attached to the project, and he was supposed to play Sharif, the Muslim character, the film wouldn't have gotten greenlit. So for him to have to fire Tupac was a big deal, but they were able to keep going and make the film. But yeah, it was going to be an all-star kind of rap cast.
What's Eight's line about getting the 40 ounce? What is it?
Y'all slinging all this in the hood, but ain't got no ends on the petro.
That's it. That's the line. Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it, man.
Yeah.
So yeah, we got some new music on the playlist. I'll let everyone just check that out on their own. A lot, as you said, it was hard to narrow down just to 4 or 5 Black Thought joints and L. Michels Affair. But what's your song of the week, man?
Song of the week for me is the title track, Glorious Game. That one instantly hit me. There's a bunch that did, but that one spoke to me just right out of the gate. How about you?
It's crazy, man, because I didn't imagine that we would be mentioning Gift of Gab's passing or Black Alicious' time at MCA, but I knew what my song of the week was, and it's Swan Lake by Black Alicious. I've been listening to a lot of that early soul side stuff, and it just brings me so much joy and just phenomenal hip hop. If people have never heard it, check that out. The Melodica EP.
Word. Dope stuff.
Yes, sir.
Right,
well, till we do it again.
Yep. Always a pleasure.
All right. Likewise. Peace.
Later.